So this is the title of the talk. Now, it is actually the Avignon Papacy and the Western Schism, because I realised you can't really talk about the Western Schism without at least mentioning the Avignon Papacy in passing. The Western Schism itself involved a form of Avignon Papacy, so the two are very easily confused. What you are seeing in front of you, does anybody know what that is a picture of? That's the Papal Palace at Avignon, thank you, exactly. Avignon is still there, it's on the banks of the Rhone, it's a sort of medieval city, and it hasn't really grown an awful lot in the last 600 years. So 1378 to 1417 are the dates of the Western Schism. We will look a little bit at the Avignon Papacy on our way through next. Okay. So this is the order I thought we'd do it in. First of all, we'll have a look at where things ended up. We'll start at the end. And then we'll go back to the beginning. We'll first of all look at the background, how it began, how it continued, and how it ended. Okay, and then if there is time at the end, there will be a time for questions and answers, and there are at least one or two kind of controversies that I think persist to this day that want looking at, but we'll just see how that goes, okay? All right. So this is how it ends up. On the screen in front of you now are pictures of three popes. Two paintings and I think a mosaic. Gregory XII, Benedict XIII and John the 23rd. The remarkable thing about these three popes is that they were reigning all at the same time. So in fact, only one of them was pope and the other two were anti-popes. But if you were alive at the time, you'd be hard-pressed to say which was which. It would depend who you asked, which would depend to some extent what country you were in. To this day, I don't think anybody is 100% certain who ended up being the real pope. And I'm going to try and avoid telling you this is how it is, or this is what I think. I'm not certain. That's all I will say about that. There's one of the three who I think we can pretty certainly say by that point wasn't the Pope. There's one who common opinion today would say was definitely the Pope, and then there's one who common opinion up until very recently said was the Pope, and I'm not 100% certain what the right answer is, but we will see, and I would be interested to know what you think by the end. Right, next please. So this is just something I picked up off the internet. It gives you a sort of a graphic, an idea of what we're talking about. Rome, everybody knows, is where the Pope resides. It's the seat of the Apostolic See. And there were popes in Rome all the way through this period, but there were also popes in Avignon all the way through this period. And as I mentioned already, the Apostolic See had moved to Avignon for quite a while, right up to this point, right before this. So that confused people. There are two popes who came out of the Council of Pisa. They didn't necessarily reside in Pisa, which is how we end up at the end with those three popes. There they are again, Gregory XII, Benedict XIII and John the 23rd. Okay, and by the end of it, so you'll see here it begins in the latter 1300s and it sort of comes to an end by the early 1400s. This chap here, I think in the end he ended his life as Bishop of Mallorca, which is where he's buried today. He did cease, as it were, being Pope, claiming to be Pope. Right, next. Okay, so here's a little bit about the background. We need to talk about the Babylonian captivity, as it became known, the Babylonian captivity of Avignon. In particular, St. Catherine of Siena and Gregory XI, and then the Papal Conclave of 1378, which is what leads to the Western Schism. This map here shows the Papal States. There really isn't a country in Europe at that time, with the possible exceptions of sort of England, Scotland, where it's one united country. Many of you will realise the concept of a nation state is a very 1800s kind of thing. Italy wasn't united until the Risorgimento in the mid-1800s. Germany, of course, wasn't a country, united nation state, until after the Franco-Prussian War, 1870. So all of these countries are not, we talk about France, we talk about the area where they speak French and think like Frenchmen. But of course, during this period, some of you will have spotted, the 100 Years' War is going on. And you have the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. And Joan of Arc later on. And the Burgundians, of course, were on the side of England, so Burgundy clearly isn't part of France. You have different regions in France, different regions in Spain. Aragon is not the same kingdom as Castile. This little green dot here is Avignon. It belongs to the Papal States by this point. It was given to the popes as a gift by King Louis IX of France, who was a saint. I think he's the only French king to become a saint. Saint Louis IX gave Avignon as a gift, and it becomes part of the Papal States. Just the city and the area immediately around it. Italy itself, other than the Papal States, which are in green, is a patchwork of different sort of loyalties and obediences. And they, at this point in time, there's a lot of squabbling going on and a lot of kind of regional wars between Florence and Venice and all these different... And of course, all of them are secretly hoping that they can grab a bit of the Papal States while the Pope isn't looking. Why are there Papal States? It's a concept that's a little bit foreign to us now, because we're used to the idea of this thing called the Vatican that was created in the Concordat with Mussolini. Excuse me. The Pope is a temporal ruler as well as a spiritual ruler, you see. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense that the Pope should, as it were, have his own country, because if he's in somebody else's country, he's going to be a subject of whoever that ruler is. And a subject in these days, you really are subject to your ruler. And the Pope wields a sufficiently important spiritual authority that it just wouldn't be right at all for him to be the subject of any king or prince or ruler or even republic. So therefore, the way around that is that he has his own country, his own state, of which he is the head of state. So the Papal States are effectively an elective monarchy where the cardinals elect the new monarch. And the papacy is, and always has been and still is, it's effectively a monarchy, the papal monarchy. All right, so that's the position of the Papal States at the time. Right, let's go forwards, shall we? So here we are. There's Avignon again. So that's the Papal Palace. This is the current Google Maps, Palais des Papes. It says there. You might not be able to see. Yeah, right bang in the middle of it. It's a great tourist attraction now. But it's pretty big. It kind of looks like a castle because it was originally a castle. And it was added to. So do I need to move forwards? Let me have a look, please. Yeah, there we go. That's the original bit of the Papal Palace and the church. That's the bit that was added to later on. They effectively doubled the size. Right, yeah, you can go forwards and we'll list all of these popes here. So these are the Avignon popes. The origin of the Avignon Papacy... That's the last one. Good, thank you. The origin of the Avignon Papacy is... I kind of shrank from going too much into detail because we'd need to go even further back to explain that. This is the problem with talking about history. You keep going further back to explain what happened then. Effectively, it's all of this constant fighting between different city-states in Italy, which always draws the Papal States in. And the fact that the Pope is a kind of a monarch and a head of state in his own right, very often he will fight wars against other Italian cities. Sometimes if he has difficulty recruiting for his army, he will just simply pay hired mercenaries. That was fairly common at the time as well. But he also has spiritual weapons at his disposal, such as excommunication and interdict. I think there was a war against Florence at some point in this earlier period of history where the Pope simply put the city under interdict, and that means no sacraments at all, full stop. And that include not just Mass and confession, no baptisms, no confessions, no last rites for anyone who's dying. Yep. And what that does is it puts pressure on the ruler from his people who are not getting any sacraments to find a way to make peace. But he can declare that something is a crusade. And then you get all sorts of benefits for taking part in it. You're taking part, in effect, in a holy war. The French king, who was alive in the late 1200s, Philip le Bel, Philip the Fair he's known, has a very famous squabble with the Pope at the time, Boniface VIII. And that has something to do with this as well. Also, there is an ongoing, I would describe it almost as a sort of Cold War between the popes and the emperors. Now, the emperor, even though he's sort of styled Holy Roman Emperor, in effect, he's the emperor of Germany, or the Germanies. And the German emperor is an important... that Germany is all sorts of kingdoms and princedoms and dukedoms and so on, but they all owe their loyalty to the German emperor. Famously, Henry IV had a quarrel with Saint Gregory VII, who made him walk barefoot in the snow as part of his penance. Well, that whole kind of tension is still going on. So to cut a long story short, one of these popes, I think Clement V actually, who's the successor of Boniface VIII, moves out of Italy, out of harm's way, to Avignon, because it's his and because he can. Well, he dies. All the cardinals are already in Avignon. The Pope has suddenly died. The simplest thing is to hold the conclave in Avignon. So they do. They hold the conclave in Avignon. What comes out of the conclave of Avignon? A new Pope. And he sees no reason at all why they should move. So without anybody necessarily intending it, it seems from that moment onwards, the papacy is now permanently established in southern France on the banks of the Rhone. The reason I put these names here is because you can see, look at that, there's not an Italian name in there. Bertrand de Gaulle was the name of Clement V, Jacques Duez, Jacques Fournier, Pierre Roger, Etienne Aubert, Guillaume de Grimoire, and finally Pierre Roger de Beaufort, who became Pope Gregory XI. A little bit of each of them here. There's a lot of information on each of the lives of these popes, but I just thought I'd give you a little taste. So Clement V was the Archbishop of Bordeaux, and he was a personal friend of King Philip IV of France, which may also have had something to do with why they decided to stay in France. Jacques Duez is the bishop. He's literally the Bishop of Avignon. So the second conclave that they held there, they just elected the local bishop as the Pope. The last but one, Urban V, is interesting. He's the only one who really is a very holy man. The popes in these days, because they're heads of state, they live like it. They're princes and they live like it. And also, and this is an increasing scandal, the cardinals do as well. The cardinals each have their own court, and they'll have their own kind of, an army of servants and kind of footmen and cooks, and also stables of horses and packs of hounds and all this kind of thing. They live like a monarch. Guillaume de Grimoire, when he becomes Pope, he was a Benedictine monk, and he just said, well, I want to stay a Benedictine. So he kept wearing his habit, and he lived a very holy life. Apparently he lived as Pope still by the rule of Saint Benedict, and became a blessed. He was beatified. Also worthy of note is the fact that Gregory XI is the nephew of Clement VI. Okay? He also even has the same name. And he makes him a cardinal at the age of 18, his nephew. Clement VI makes his nephew, who has the same name as him, a cardinal when he's 18 years old. Now again, that might seem scandalous to us. It is scandalous, but we might be tempted to think, well, how on earth could anybody justify that? It wasn't unheard of at the time. And at a time where you need somebody who has a sufficient education and the right kind of an education, who understands the things of the church and all that kind of thing, who's been educated in theology and canon law, also somebody who you can really trust and rely on. I'm not saying that this makes it okay. I'm simply suggesting, had you been able somehow to ask Clement VI, why are you making your nephew Pierre Roger a cardinal, he might have given you some sort of an answer like that, which plausibly makes some sort of sense. I know that he's fitted for the job, and I know that I can rely on him. But one of the side effects of all of this, it's a period of 70 odd years, 73 years actually. In fact, no, sorry, slightly less than 70 years, because it's Clement V who moves there. One of the effects of all of this is you have French popes. Well, of course, you have French cardinals, and you have there's disproportionately all the cardinals are Frenchmen, and that means it's far more likely you're going to get a French pope. So you can understand, I think, how this sort of snowballed. Also, excuse me, it goes without saying that Avignon just booms economically. Rome at the same time has been shrinking and shrinking because nobody goes there anymore. Why would you? There's no pope there. In this period, there are a total of 134 new cardinals created. I don't mean that there were ever that many at any one time. I mean, when a few cardinals have died of old age, the Pope holds a consistory and he makes some new ones. If you add those all up over the 70 years, 134 cardinals are created. 111 of them are French. And it's something like 10 or 11 Italians, 5 Spaniards, 2 Englishmen. Not a single German. And there's no German cardinal for about 200 years until the mid-1400s. There already hadn't been one for a while here. All the other apparatus that goes with the papal court is now in Avignon as well. So you have all the revenues there. There are, all sorts of money from the church that is being spent on the church, but it all passes via Avignon, and also the various sort of congregations and so on. There's a thing called the penitentiary, which deals with, not with public matters, but with private personal matters, people who are under interdict or suspension or excommunication. They can go there and have their cause heard. There are certain sins that are reserved to the Holy See that a priest can't give absolution for in confession. But the penitentiary had its own confessors who would sort of sit in the churches roundabout, and you could go and have your confession heard by them, and they had the power to absolve even those sins. But of course, that's no longer in Rome anymore, that's in Avignon. So if you need to make a pilgrimage because you did something particularly bad and then had a reformation. I think, for instance, stealing the Blessed Sacrament in order to abuse it, if you've done something like that in your past, a priest can't just give you absolution. It's reserved to the Holy See. So you could go and visit the penitentiary and become free of it in that way. But what that means now is you're making a pilgrimage to Avignon, not to Rome. Okay? All right. Yeah, next then, please. Okay. So, yeah, we'll get to this in a minute, actually. Let me just read you a little bit, because I can't not talk about St. Catherine of Siena. I did intend to put this on a slide, and I just realised this afternoon that I'd forgotten to do that. Here we go. Come like a virile man, and without any fear. This is Catherine of Siena addressing the Pope. Some of her letters to him, she couldn't read. She couldn't read or write, and she got people to write the letters for her. St. Catherine of Siena is worth a talk all in her own right. She's really a remarkable saint. She was a third order Dominican, so she's usually portrayed as wearing a Dominican habit. And she's not just a saint. She's one of those saints where holiness just is everywhere, and miracles just happen left, right, and centre wherever she goes. She would have ecstasies and levitations and all sorts of things, and she knew, she'd make prophecies, all kinds of things like that. And she got people to write letters for her, and she wrote to the popes and said to them, essentially, you've got to get back to Rome. You don't realise how much damage you're doing to the church with this holding court in Avignon. Come like a virile man, she says, and without any fear, but take heed as you value your life, not to come with armed men, but with the cross in your hand like a meek lamb. If you do so, you will fulfill the will of God, but if you come any other way, you would not fulfill but transgress it. She's writing to Pope Gregory XI, who you will remember is the last of those Avignon popes. She goes to see him at one point with a small group of friends, arrives in Avignon. So she's from Siena. She travels all the way to Avignon in southern France. In those days, that's a long way. And of course, all of the papal court are against her. They're all trying to bend the ear of Pope Gregory XI. They're all trying to get him to stay in Avignon and not go back to Rome. And all of the kind of secular nobles and all the rest of it, all the French, obviously, don't want the Pope leaving France. But she has an audience with him face-to-face, so she has one shot at it. And she, in her face-to-face audience with him, she says to him, I know all about the prayer that the silent prayer that you made when you were first elected Pope. You made this promise to our Lord. And she reveals exactly what he said in that prayer, which he'd never told anybody. So he's convinced at that point, this is a genuine saint, and this really must come from our Lord. And she just tells him in the most uncompromising terms, you have to do what you know is right. Don't let them talk you out of it. And he says, okay. And then even at the last minute, he wavers a little bit and looks like he's being talked back around to staying in Avignon. To cut a very long story short, Pope Gregory XI does return to Rome. He was a very young pope, by the way. I forget how old he was when he died. I think he was only 40 when he became pope. You'll remember he was a cardinal at 18. Young popes are not that uncommon. There's a one we'll get to later called Boniface IX, who was 33 when he became pope. It's not that uncommon. But he gets back to Rome, and it's a ghost town. The population is roughly 17,000. That's the whole population of Rome. People have just deserted it. You have abandoned buildings. You have streets where there's grass growing out in between the stone paving. And churches where they're literally falling down. Bits are falling off the roof. If you go in that church, you take your life in your hands. Rome is a shadow of its former self. It's very sad. But the papacy has returned to Rome. This picture is obviously very stylistic. It was painted much later on, but you get the idea. Okay, so the Pope enters Rome, and there's a lot of rejoicing and so on. There are still wars going on, and the Papal States are still under threat. In fact, quite a bit of the Papal States here and there have just been occupied. Other Italian states have just taken it and hoped nobody would notice. So the thing that I showed you on the map before is really very theoretical. Once you go not very far beyond Rome, the Pope's actual power to rule the Papal States is very theoretical, and in reality, they've been invaded and occupied for a while. But there are certain wars going on. The reason I mention this will become clear later on. Cardinal, it's French, so it's Robert de Genève. Cardinal Robert of Geneva commands an army of these sort of mercenaries that have been hired by the papacy to fight against Italian rivals. And one little town that they managed to capture, Cesena, the mercenaries brutally put everybody to the sword and just kill everybody, women and children and everything. So Cardinal Robert of Geneva becomes known as the butcher of Cesena. Okay. 6 months after returning, Pope Gregory XI dies. He's still in his 40s. And so what needs to happen is, of course, a conclave to elect a new pope. Right, this is where our story gets very interesting next. So, Old St. Peter's is what that says. It says around the year 1450, so this is obviously 70 years before, but it gives you some sort of an idea. St. Peter's Basilica that we know today doesn't yet exist. Does anybody know when that was built?
1530.
Yeah, early 1500s, exactly. Yeah, right on the eve of the Reformation, and in fact, you'll remember it's funds for the building of St. Peter's that really Luther starts complaining about in the early 1500s. So this is the old St. Peter's, and it's a basilica, but there's also a sort of palace, papal palace attached to it. And I don't know if this is really accurate to scale. The wall you can sort of see in the background going around. Anyway, there we go. So there is a conclave in April 1378. I could read to you from the book. This, by the way, sorry, I meant to introduce this earlier on. This is volume 3 of the excellent work by Philip Hughes. It's simply called The History of the Church, or A History of the Church. I think he ended up Monsignor Philip Hughes. He was Father Philip Hughes for most of his life, and he ended up being appointed to some academic position in a university, I think in America. I forget, Catholic University of America or Notre Dame. Sorry, Notre Dame, if you're an American, yeah. But most of his life, Philip Hughes, in the 30s and before the Second World War, he was right here, just over the road, about 100 yards away. He was the archivist of Westminster Cathedral. So and I think that was when he wrote this. It's really, really excellent. Can't recommend it enough. I largely relied on that for this, but with other bits as well. Is there anything else on this slide, or should we just go straight into the conclave? We probably want to go straight into the conclave. Can I? There's nothing else, is there? Okay, let me have a sneak peek at the next one. You'd think I would know what's on my own slide, wouldn't you? Yeah, okay, yeah, this is good. Yeah, no. Right, so there are 16 cardinals who enter the conclave. We are used to thinking in terms of there being 100 plus cardinals. In those days, there weren't that many. I think there was a law round about this time, either just before or just after, I forget, fixing the maximum number of cardinals that there could be at any one time at 24. But you have to remember, at this point in time, there's no North America, there's no South America, the Philippines. It was basically Europe, and really Western Europe. So there are 20-something cardinals that exist. There probably are about 24 cardinals. There's 16 that enter the conclave. 7 cardinals are absent. How many is that? That's 23. Okay, there we go. 23 cardinals. 6 of those absent are because they've been left behind in Avignon to take care of business. Because it's difficult, it's easy to kind of say, well, we're going to leave Avignon and go to Rome. All of the kind of daily transactions and business, it all has to be, you have to wind it down and move all the apparatus back to Rome. So Gregory XI had left 6 cardinals behind in Avignon, and there is one who is absent because he's on some sort of diplomatic mission elsewhere in Italy. So 16 of them enter the conclave. They arrive, they turn up, it's going to take place in St. Peter's, and it's worth dwelling on this because it's the key to understanding everything else that happened. For 40 years, people are going to be writing about this conclave, and accounts differ because each side is trying to argue for his side. And so here is what we can kind of gather. There's an angry mob. Rome, you'll remember, it doesn't have that big a population, but of course people have poured in from all over Italy because this is the big event. There's a conclave in Rome, first time in anyone's lifetime, first time that anyone can remember. There's a conclave in Rome. The papacy has moved back to Rome, and then the Pope has died, and you can tell what's going to happen. It's going to be another Frenchman who's elected, and the next thing he'll do, he'll move the papacy back to Avignon. And they're not having a bit of it. They're not having any of it, and they're very, very angry, and they're not very shy about letting people know. So as the cardinals arrive, they find that they're being escorted through the streets to the conclave by bands of armed men wielding whatever they can get their hands on. Some of them even come into the chamber, and the assembled cardinals in the conclave are then given a lecture. They're given a haranguing by these ruffians about exactly what it is they need to do. And it's a very simple plan. You'd better elect an Italian or else. In fact, a Roman. They really want a Roman. Romano lo volemo is what they're shouting. Romano lo volemo. But they'll settle for an Italian. There is, in fact, only one cardinal who is a Roman. There are only 3 Italians at this point. Okay? I think on the next slide we will get a look at them.
Sorry.
There we go. Those are the names of the cardinals. Now, some of these are worth remembering. So there we go. Pietro Corsini is from Florence. Then we have loads of Frenchmen. Francesco Tebaldeschi is the only Roman. He's very elderly as well. Lots of Frenchmen, and one who's a Spaniard, Pedro de Luna. He's from the Kingdom of Aragon. Yeah. Okay, so those are our 16 electors. Once the angry mob has actually let them be and they can close the doors of the conclave, and they have to be locked in, that's the meaning of conclave, it literally means with a key, then they can get down to the business of voting. But the mob hasn't gone away, it's right there outside the windows, shouting and chanting and threatening them. And what are we going to do? There's only, I think, one cardinal who sort of says, well, I don't like the idea of having a conclave. In these circumstances, I'm not sure it's a valid vote if it's done under threats of violence. But the others don't feel that way. So they're going to have the conclave. One of them comes up with the idea of, well, I tell you what, should we just have a fake election? Let's just pick some capuchin somewhere. We'll say we've made him pope. Hooray! We'll carry him around on our shoulders and put the tiara on his head. And the mob will love it, and they'll all go home. And when they've gone home, we can get down to the serious business of having a real election and electing a genuine pope. Well, that doesn't go down very well with most of the cardinals either, so they're not going to do that either. So they sit down and have a serious think about who they can elect pope, and in the end they choose an Italian. They choose a man who has been vice-chancellor, as it were, of the papal court, and who is known for being an efficient guy, good administrator, pretty mild-mannered, not particularly controversial, won't rock the boat. Nice, gentle, quiet-spoken guy. There's only 2 real problems with it. Number 1, he's not actually a cardinal. And number 2, he's not there. He's the Archbishop of Bari, so they have to send for him. And to make it not obvious, if they just sent for him and no one else, it would be really obvious why. Everybody would say, oh, they've chosen him. So they send for about 3 people, bishops and archbishops, and they arrive. And I think while they're being given their supper in the evening, one of the people serving them says, oh, maybe you guys have been chosen because one of you is going to be elected pope or something like that. And so they all have a good old laugh about that. And that night, the mob still doesn't disperse even after nightfall. Now that it's dark, they're having a bonfire with all the looted furniture and all the rest of it. And a few of them have broken into the papal wine cellar, so they all get uproariously drunk. They're singing songs, they're chanting, they're having a great time. The cardinals are still locked in. The next morning, I would imagine it was pretty quiet early in the morning, but once they've kind of woken up and sobered up a little bit, they get back to it again. And their numbers have just grown and grown. And there comes a point where the cardinals' fear and panic genuinely seems to enter into their minds. And they're beginning to fear for their lives. So the second day of the conclave, one of them says, well, should we get down to the business of voting for who's going to be pope? And another one says, well, but we elected the Archbishop of Bari, didn't we? And they all agree, yeah, we did. Okay. But what's going on in the meantime is the Chamberlain, the message comes through from him, I don't know how long I can keep these guys out. They're literally putting axes to the doors, and then they break in. I can't keep them out any longer. And of course, at that point, some of the cardinals literally flee for their lives. Some of them go and hide somewhere. A few of them can't get away, so they're found in there. One or two of them are so afraid that they go through the farce of grabbing hold of Cardinal Tebaldeschi, who you will remember is the only Roman, dressing him up in the papal tiara on the altar and saying Habemus Papam in front of all the mob to try and placate them. And Tebaldeshi's having none of it. He says, no, he's really outraged. He says, put me down, you know very well I'm not the Pope. It's the Archbishop of Bari that we've elected, which everybody overhears, and that's how the poor man discovers that he's become Pope. He hears it from the protests of Cardinal Tebaldeshi. Right, let's go on. Okay, next. So, 15 out of 16 votes go to this guy. There's Bari down there, by the way, just to give you an idea. Rome, of course, is about halfway down on the left. Prignani is his name. And what happens, to cut a long story short, after that, the mob are pretty happy. They go home, and that's the end of that. And, of course, things settle down and quieten down. Once all the violence and turmoil is over, all the cardinals who'd gone and hid under the sofa, they all come out of hiding, and they kind of get together and they confirm their vote a third time, and they do the remainder of the ceremony, which is where the candidate is offered the papacy, and he's told, you have been elected Pope, do you accept? And he has to say yes or no. If you're elected Pope, you can turn it down. Yes, volo or nolo. Yeah, I'm willing or I'm not willing are the two options that you have. So he says, volo, I'm willing. And so he becomes Pope. He is crowned with the papal tiara in St. Peter's Basilica in a ceremony in front of everybody. I think this is Palm Sunday by this point. This is April 1378. And a few days later, he goes in procession with all of the cardinals with him, takes possession of St. John Lateran. He's the Pope. Great, we have a Pope again. And it's not a Frenchman, it's an Italian, and he's going to stay in Rome and not move back to Avignon. Everything's looking brilliant. What could possibly go wrong? Well, what goes wrong is that the mild-mannered Archbishop of Bari turns out to be a tyrant. In fact, he's a genuine monster. And Hughes even says he's not sure what happens to him. Maybe it's that the shock of becoming Pope somehow overthrew the balance of his mind. Or maybe it's the pent-up rage for so many years of a good man seeing corruption and not being able to do anything about it. He is kind of anti-corruption. He is kind of a reformer, and he's particularly horrible to his cardinals because he sees all of the wealth and luxury, the way that they live, and he's not very backwards about being forwards, as it were, in telling them what he thinks. And he the tiniest thing, he'll fly into a rage. He sort of reminds one a little bit of the Emperor Caligula. It's not so much that he's evil, evil, evil all the time. It's just that he's unpredictable. So everybody is on eggshells around him because they never quite know what he's going to do or say next. One of the cardinals, you'll remember, who was on a diplomatic mission elsewhere in Italy, had come back for the papal conclave, but he missed it. He arrived just in time to discover that he'd missed the conclave and this chap has been elected Pope. Well, he gets in a real sulk and he sits there and refuses to actually go into Rome and kind of meet the new Pope. He kind of sets up shop just outside of Rome. What that does in effect is it means all one by one, these other cardinals, as they get alienated by Pope Urban VI, they go and join this chap, and before long you have two groups, those that are with the Pope and those that aren't with the Pope. And once they're there, they're not coming back into Rome, and they're sort of being disobedient to him, but without openly saying so. Urban VI makes the fatal mistake of sending two or three cardinals to them as envoys to tell them, look, I'm sorry, I'll mend my ways, come back. And those are the Italians he sends. The minute they get there, they switch sides and join the guys who are in open rebellion against it. And in effect, he's abandoned by all of his cardinals, every single one of them. Oh, the 6 that are in Avignon, I forgot to mention, they were sent word that Prignani, Archbishop of Bari, has been elected Pope. Urban VI, and the six cardinals in Avignon, they lead the rejoicing and the processions in the street of thanksgiving to God. We have a pope again, and so on and so on. Right? Okay. Right. Next, please. So, here we go. This is a very, very brief timeline. I mentioned Tebaldeshi. This is the last time we'll hear about him, the only Roman there. He dies in, Hughes says it's either August or September, nobody's quite sure, of 1378. So a few months after the papal conclave. He's the only one who remains loyal to Pope Urban VI. And by September, he's died of old age anyway. What happens with these other cardinals? Well, they are all ensconced together, and the one thing they all agree on is that they hate Pope Urban VI. And you can see what's going to happen gradually, and it really doesn't take that long. They all decide that election that we had wasn't a real election anyway because of the violence and the threats and so forth. They're in touch with the King of France, and in fact they send out an encyclical letter to the entire church, signed by all the cardinals, saying the papal conclave, which we just held, just ignore it. It's not a real conclave. It's not valid because of the violence and because of the threat. It happened under duress. Okay? The King of France then encourages them, because you can see the next logical step. That means we don't have a pope. There wasn't a real conclave, and therefore there's no real pope. Well, then you'd have to have a real conclave and elect a real pope. So that's what they then do. They go to, I think the Duke of Fondi gives them his castle, which is even further from Rome and even safer, where they can't be, captured by troops sent by Urban VI, and they hold a papal conclave. And Cardinal Robert of Geneva, the butcher of Cesena, you'll remember, is elected and takes the name Clement VII. Okay? So you have these two popes in Italy facing each other. Each one tries to drive the other out by force of arms. It ends in a sort of stalemate. Clement VII doesn't manage to drive Urban VI out of Rome. So in the end, he falls back on Naples. Naples at that time is ruled by a queen called Joanna, Queen Joanna of Naples, Giovanna, who is an interesting character, to put it mildly. She had all sorts of husbands and men who weren't her husband, and several of her husbands, at least one or two of them, she's supposed to have murdered. Not a very wholesome character, but she welcomes Clement VII with open arms, and he has this great triumphal entry into Naples. The only problem is that the actual people of Naples aren't very impressed, and they say, I think they're very much on the side of the Roman Pope, and so Clement VII realizes his position there isn't really safe. So by 1379, you've guessed it, he's taken the papal court back to Avignon. Okay, so now you have two popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon. And which one is the real one? And it's not simply a question of, well, I'm going to follow authority. Which authority? The Pope is the highest authority in the church. And that's the whole question, is who the Pope is. Well, who's the next authority down from the Pope? The cardinals, right? Okay. You can understand, I think, why somebody might have been tempted to think, well, it's Clement VII, because the entire College of Cardinals is now saying Urban VI isn't really the Pope, Clement VII is. And yet, all of Christendom, all of Europe, in effect, the whole civilized world, is split more or less 50-50. I would say, if anything, probably Clement VII has the advantage. He probably has more support. I think we have a map on the next slide. There we go. So you'll see this map. If you look up the Western Schism, you'll see this map all over the place, which is useful. What would be more useful would be a map showing how it changed over time, but one can only ever seem to find what it says here, 1378 to 1417, but in fact this is a map of 1378. It does change over time. Right, notice in pink are the supporters of Clement VII. There is Naples down the bottom. This looks like one kingdom. It's not, but they all support Urban, or they all recognise Urban as Pope. Castile and Aragon, basically Spain, supports along with France, Clement VII. You'll notice down the bottom is a kingdom called Granada, which is neither blue nor pink. Does anybody know why that is?
Maybe it's the last Moorish emirate.
Yeah, it's not. They still haven't driven the Muslims out. Yeah, and that won't happen until 1492. Portugal starts off looking maybe Clement VII, but pretty quickly they then go over to the side of the Roman Pope. England and France are at war. So not surprisingly, we supported the Roman Pope. And of course, it goes without saying, if England is supporting Rome, then Scotland is going to support Avignon, right? Germany, which is a bit of a fluid concept in these days, it sort of includes Poland, even though it doesn't, and it sort of includes Hungary, even though it doesn't. You'll notice that's all blue, and you might think, well, and in fact Scandinavia as well, what you can't show on a map is how important a country is, and really France is the dominant place. That's not just physically the geographical centre, it's also politically the centre of gravity. France is a much more important country, really, than anywhere else in Europe at this point in time. And the Kingdom of Cyprus, there we go, down the bottom. For what that is worth, they recognise Clement VII. And again, they're not, within 100 or so years, they're gone, aren't they, again, because of the Muslim invasions. In fact, I think it's the Knights of Malta originally came from... Did they come from Cyprus or Rhodes? Rhodes. All right. So there we are. That's how things stack up at the beginning. Split down the middle as to who is the real Pope. And you have two Holy Sees, two colleges of cardinals, because, of course, Urban VI has been abandoned by all his cardinals. Well, what do you think he does? He makes new cardinals. In fact, I think he makes something like 28 of them all in one go. They're my new cardinals. So now you have two colleges of cardinals. And people very quickly start to realise that this isn't just a split. It's going to be an ongoing problem from now on. And things are never going to be the same. There's no way out of this. Because only a pope can make cardinals. Only a real pope can make real cardinals. And only real cardinals can make a real pope. So you have two colleges of cardinals. They're going to perpetuate the whole thing. Next. Okay. So this is what we saw there. Yeah. Clement VII has all the original cardinals that were appointed by Gregory XI, the last pope before the schism. What will happen is they grow old and die off, and he just makes new ones. So as time goes on, I suppose he has a sort of moral advantage, Clement VII does, in that, to begin with, he can say, well, I have all the real cardinals. Everybody in the world, no matter what side, realises that my cardinals are real cardinals. Right? Urban VI's new cardinals, well, we don't even know if he's pope, so maybe they're not really cardinals. Everybody knows my cardinals are real cardinals, but of course, that doesn't last. And so pretty quickly, nobody's sure which is the real college of cardinals. Okay, next. Right. So I thought we'd have a look at the arguments in favour of each side. By the way, spoiler alert, it turns out it was Urban VI all along who was the real pope. But there's a certain... I don't like being too sort of glib and smug about this is the real answer. Everybody knows this. Okay, why? If it was so obvious, this whole situation would never have happened. So we want to kind of put ourselves into the shoes of those people at the time and try and appreciate why so many people got it so wrong and why this was such a big problem. More ink was spilt on arguing to and fro over this question than anything else. So this is the argument in favour of Clement VII. That's his coat of arms, by the way. This is it. The papal election, the conclave was held under duress, and duress invalidates a decision in effect. Okay, it means the outward appearance of a decision, but it's not real. Now that's a plausible argument. If you sign a contract today and it's under duress, it doesn't count. And if you can prove it was under duress, it can be voided. In fact, there's a way of writing, I think it's vico actus. Is that what you write? it means I did it and I was forced to do it, and that doesn't count. Similarly, with a marriage, very, very rarely were annulments granted in the days before the council, in the 50s and earlier. But one of the things that infallibly would get you an annulment would be if the fact that you could show that you were actually under threat and didn't have a free choice. The mafia boss said he would murder my entire family if I didn't marry his daughter. Okay, that means it's not a real marriage, because you didn't freely choose it, you did it under threat. They're making the same argument here as regards the choice of the new pope. The entire College of Cardinals, all appointed by previous popes, when allowed the leisure to consider the matter without any threat, had concluded that Prignani's election was void, and this included the 7 cardinals who had been absent from the conclave, the 6 in Avignon and the 1 elsewhere in Italy. Okay, the same entire College of Cardinals, all appointed by previous popes, all nationalities, not just only the French, but all of them, had elected Cardinal Robert as Clement VII. So claims of national rivalries or loyalties can't be made, because even the Italian cardinals had agreed to that. And finally, who has the authority to declare whether a papal conclave is valid or invalid? Because normally the highest authority in the church is the Pope, but here it's the Pope who's the very thing, the matter in question. So surely the next highest authority down is the College of Cardinals, isn't it? So that's their argument. And if the entire College of Cardinals declares his election is invalid, surely they are the highest authority. Okay, next. So these are the arguments on behalf of Urban VI. Okay? It's an almost unanimous vote. Remember, it's 15 votes out of 16. One of them, the only one who didn't vote for him, I think, was the one, I forget his name, who said, no, we can't hold the election because of the violence. Yeah.
It's the first one about election being under duress.
Yeah.
We argue, because if Urban VI turned out to be a good guy.
Oh, of course. No, absolutely. Yeah, there's no doubt at all they wouldn't be making any of those arguments had he been a nice guy to get on with. They only started doing that after he alienated them. Yeah, that's really the key to understanding this. But this, after the fact, that all gets a little bit lost in the in the arguing to and fro. Yeah. So he was chosen twice on 2 consecutive days. Remember that? They confirmed their choice. He'd been publicly hailed as Pope, crowned with a tiara, taken possession of St. John Lateran, all after that threat of violence had been removed. So that kind of invalidates that argument. And yeah, it's only when he began to displease them that they then came up with this scheme of he's not really the Pope, let's have a new one. Okay? And they had sent the news to the cardinals left behind in Avignon, and they had publicly rejoiced and said Urban VI is Pope as well. So, yeah. Okay, next. Right. Stop. Back. Right, you're not meant to see the answers before I've asked the question. Right. Catherine of Siena, then. Next slide.
Oh, Rome, sure.
Yeah. Which saint backed which papacy? Right. You can call the answers out. First one should be Catherine of Siena. Rome, yeah, well, you've seen the answer, so all right. Next.
Avignon.
St. Vincent Ferrer. I don't know why the formatting suddenly doesn't work. I did change this. Avignon, very good. He was actually Spanish, I think. And so he's Spanish, so he's an Avignon supporter. And St. Catherine of Siena is from Siena, which is in Italy, so yeah. Next. Right, St. Catherine of Sweden, who's the daughter of St. Bridget of Sweden. Does anybody know? Rome, yes. Next. Blessed Peter of Luxembourg.
Rome.
I hear a Rome and I hear an Avignon. Any advance? Anybody else think Rome?
Well, Avignon was very French, wasn't it? So surely it was French.
Okay, good logic there. I like that. He's Avignon. Okay, next. Right, Saint Colette. I think she's a Poor Clare and she's a reformer of the Poor Clares. She's a nun. The answer is Rome and Later, Avignon. She started out supporting Rome, and later she went over to Avignon. Just to give you a bit, and there are other saints and blesseds, to give you a bit of a taste of what the world is like then. Nobody is certain who the real Pope is, and you have saints on either side. Okay, next slide, please. So here we go. As time goes by, the problem is not resolved, and it steadily becomes even more messy and complicated. Each Pope excommunicates the other. That goes without saying. It follows a logic. I'm the real Pope, therefore who does this guy think he is? And you excommunicate him. All right. When Urban VI dies, his cardinals elect a successor, Boniface IX. That's in 1389. This is the new College of Cardinals that he created. But if you're an Avignon supporter, you're going to say, well, they're not real cardinals, and in any case, the Pope is still alive, and his name is Clement VII. Right? So they don't recognise him. Goes without saying. When Clement VII dies, his cardinals elect a successor, Benedict XIII. Benedict XIII, his name is Pedro de Luna. The only cardinal from Spain, exactly. The Aragonese cardinal in the original conclave. And I think he was St. Vincent Ferrer's bishop. St. Vincent Ferrer, you'll remember, was a priest. He was a Dominican friar and a famous preacher. Meanwhile, the University of Paris tries tirelessly to resolve the split. So I need to talk a little bit about the University of Paris. It's not the only university, and there are loads of universities all over Europe at this point in time. Some are bigger and more prestigious than others. Oxford has its mind occupied with a lot of this stuff. The University of Paris is probably the biggest and most prestigious one, and it's in France. Okay. It's divided not into colleges, it's divided into nations, depending on where you're from. But I think there's only 4 nations originally, the French, the English, the Picards, oddly enough, and I think, what's the 4th one? Is it the Spanish or the Germans? I want to say the Germans. And I think if you're sort of from Hungary, well, you go in with the Germans, or if you're Spanish, you go in with the French. I think that's how it works.
Who are the Picards?
Picardy is in eastern France. It's just above sort of Alsace-Lorraine. But obviously at this point it's its own region. Yeah, does that sort of make sense? Yeah, okay. It's a region of what today we would call France.
Mr.
Yeah.
Taylor, we're just approaching an hour. Is there a good time for a half-time break? Does it need to be now? But...
Yes, if I go for about... Can I have a quick look? Sorry.
We're 20 out of 56.
Okay.
So we do
20 out of 56. Right, I'll try and get through things quicker. If I go for another 10 minutes and then we have a 20-minute break, does anybody have a serious objection? Okay, good. But the University of Paris, all the greatest minds in the world, are the one topic that really occupies their minds is how to solve this horrible problem. And to begin with, of course, the English, the University of Paris itself is divided because the English support Urban in Rome and the French support Clement VII in Avignon. The University of Paris declares itself neutral, but there's all sorts of political back and fro with the King of France. So later on, as a quid pro quo, the University of Paris officially supports the Avignon popes. But at this point in time, they solicit suggestions as to how to fix the problem. And they leave a big old wooden box, iron bound, for people to put bits of paper in on which they've written their suggestions, thinking they may get 100 or even 200. I think they end up with more than 10,000 in the end. And then they have to appoint people to read through all of them and kind of make some sort of sense of it, which they do. It takes a little while, but in the end it turns out that most of the suggestions, if you boil it down, they fit into 3 broad categories, 3 variations on how to end the Western Schism. Number 1, you get both popes to resign simultaneously. And then the College of Cardinals comes together and you elect a new pope who everybody recognises. Well, good luck making that happen, because even if you could prevail upon the one that you support to be willing to resign, it's going to be a bit of a Mexican standoff, isn't it? I'll do it if you do it. Well, I'll do it if you do it. How are you going to make that happen? So option number 2 No more papal conclaves, and we just wait for both of them to die. Well, okay, but I mean, what if they live to a grand old age? What if one of them dies and then the other is still alive? That one then has an advantage, because these guys have got a pope and these guys don't. So there's that. And also the College of Cardinals is going to get old and die, so you'd better hope that the pope dies before most of the cardinals do. Option 3, call a council, and we'll let the council sort it all out. And this is the origin, we might get to this later on, of what becomes the conciliar heresy, this idea that you have regular councils and the pope is held to account by them, and instead of a papal monarchy, you have a bit like the kind of fake monarchy that we have here, constitutional monarchy, where really it's Parliament that controls everything. You're going to have regular councils, and they can hire and fire popes depending on whether they approve what they did or not. That heresy doesn't really develop yet, but this is the origin of it. We're desperate to find a solution. Maybe the solution is we get a council together and the council can bang heads together and say who's the pope and who isn't, or get rid of all of them and start afresh. Okay? All right, let me just see what's coming next. Okay, we will pause there. I'm going to talk next a little bit about what each pope does, and then we'll talk about how it got fixed.